Well, greetings, Carl.
Hello, Michael Kitces.
How are you doing?
Things are, I'm really good. Yeah, things are great.
Season is turning there.
Yeah, I mean, we alternate from, storms with a foot of snow to grass. And it's that time of year. We call it mud season. There's, the
You don't
trails
have
are
spring,
muddy.
you have winter mud season and summer. Is that
And
how it works there?
what is it? Winter mud season, summer mud season, winter
Okay.
mud season. Yeah, yeah, like that. I have a friend that lives up in the mountains, and he says what did he say? We have 10 months of winter and 2 months of bad snowmobiling.
I
All right. That's great.
like
It's not
that.
quite that bad. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, I now was saying like beautiful, well, I guess beautiful weather when it's not too muddy there. Um, I feel like we are back in one of those times where we need to have that conversation again. Uh, we need to have the scary markets conversation again. I
Really.
went and looked it up. We The last time like we really had scary markets conversations was heading into COVID when
That
markets got
is
really really scary.
that is wild.
And we had some hiccups over the past few years, but just to be where we are back in one of those places where things get really not just scary because volatile things are happening, but scary because volatile things are happening and no one's really sure whether or what's coming next, right? And just it reminds me of, I mean, COVID environments where, right, March of 2020 and no one knows what's going to happen, financial crisis in 2008 where we're trying to keep clients on board and it's like, no, you're going to be okay. I'm like, I really hope you're going to be okay because I'm actually not 100% certain the financial system is going to be here on Monday, but I figure if it's not, all this is going to be a moot point. So we're going to try to keep you on board.
Mhm.
And now we're getting into a new
Mhm.
round of this as tariffs are firing off, markets are reacting. And I don't even necessarily want to make this a political discussion around relative merits of tariffs. Someone else can go there. But a lot of us now are starting to get some of those conversations. Phone rings, email comes in, at least it gets brought up in a client review like markets have gotten scary. I'm not sure how much more of this is coming. It kind of
Mhm.
sounds like the administration still wants to do a lot more of this. Markets, as we know, generally don't do well with uncertainty, so that often makes them grind lower. And I mean, to me, there's something very fundamental from clients of I don't like it when markets go down. Some tariff things happened and markets went down. The administration is saying more tariffs. It seems like the very straightforward answer is, well, then sell. Tariffs down, more tariffs. It's not hard to figure the logic chain here.
Yeah.
And then we have to respond.
Yeah.
And and
Yeah.
so you are the great gifted one of scary markets conversations. So all I know how to do is like logic my way through what are the possibilities where tariffs can actually end up having some partial positive effects for the economy, and then we'll see how it weighs out in the next year or two. But this is not a logic conversation for most clients. That's like
Yeah.
not the place it comes from. And I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
intellectually curious about tariffs and all the scenarios that it could play out in the economy. Advisor, please talk to me about it. Is like not a conversation I've had. Uh, I'm scared the markets have been going down in response to tariffs. They say more are coming, and I'm not sure I should stay in.
Yeah. Man, it's so
So how
this
do
is
you handle
fun
this?
because a fun conversation just because it's really I have I think the first step we all have to admit to ourselves is that it's actually hard, right? Like standing between being the release valve for this sort of anxiety, I believe is part of the job. And I think it's the hardest part of the job. And I think we have these long periods of time. Sometimes they're 5, 6, 7 years, but
Yep.
often 2 or 3 years at least, where you kind of forget about it, right? Like it's
Yeah.
smooth sailing and this is all fun and games, and then things happen. So whether this is one of those things or whether this is just a week or two of weirdness, I don't know. But I know that these things happen. And so I think first acknowledging like I think it'd be fun to talk about this from two perspectives. One, um, how do you actually have the conversation with the client? And number two, what are you doing for yourself to make sure that you can continue to take care of clients and yourself, right? Like,
Okay.
how are you building general resilience? So let me just start with a like conversation, and I'll just I can take you through what I believe to be important steps, and I'll just pause and we'll
Okay.
talk about them.
Jeez.
I think the first thing, like what you acknowledged, is that the facts and the logic behind this, I've been accused of dismissing that, and I want to make it clear if I was ever dismissive about that, I was wrong. I never meant to be. The facts and the logic really matter. I just think the order of presentation, the
Yeah.
sequencing of it is the important part. Because when that call first comes in, I think the way I think about it, I have a sketch about this, is like first a hug, right? Like lecture later, and the hug is probably metaphorical, right? But it's like first a hug, because when somebody calls, we've got to remember to actually send the email or to actually make the call most likely represents, I don't know how long, but a lot of thinking and angst and worry and concern before. Don't you think that's reasonable?
Yeah, I think you may have said this in like in the past in an episode long many years ago, and it did very much strike home to me that particularly if it's a client relationship that we've had for any period of time, they know roughly what we're going to say.
Right.
It's like, no, you're of course you're not supposed to sell. In fact, you're supposed to
Yeah,
buy. But like, no, don't
yeah,
sell. So they know what we're going to say and they call it anyways.
yep,
And to me, like just once you recognize that, now granted, like asterisk, not true maybe if it's a much younger client who's just started working with you, a much younger client who's never been through scary markets themselves, like that's not part of their career life
yeah,
experience yet. So like that's all asterisk that can be like genuinely different, where maybe they really don't know what you're gonna say and how you're gonna react. But for some clients that we've been with some period of time, or even if they're newer to us, but they are of an age and stage in life that I'm probably not the first advisor in their lives, they all kind of know that we're going to say some version of no, you're not supposed to sell.
right,
They're calling anyways. And
right.
to me, that it just even gets interesting to reflect on like, so why did they call when they knew what we were going to say? And what do they ask? I mean, what do
Yeah,
they really ask?
yeah. I think
Asking.
that's really important, like empathetically to remember that they they're not calling. They're most likely calling because they're nervous or scared or anxious. And when you're in that state, which we have all been in, and many of us, these scary markets are scary to us too, right? So like you probably can relate. It, what you want first is to be, now you may not be aware of this. You may not be calling, like you're not going to call and say, give me a hug, right? Like you're calling to get like some relief, some help, but it doesn't work when somebody's in an irrational state. It doesn't work to spray them with facts and figures. It doesn't work you can't reason with somebody who's being irrational. Like try that with your teenage son. It doesn't work. What you want to be is heard first. So I think that's like stage one of the scary markets conversation is greet with empathy, right? So like you answer that phone call, you see that email, there's a temptation, and I'm sure we're seeing it right now. I'm not on social media at all, but I'm sure we're seeing it right now on Twitter of like, just hold the course, no time is different, like all these like don't do something stupid. Like all these things of like look at the little humans making their little human mistakes this sense of smugness that sort of enters sometimes and I'm talking about the collective investment industry, probably not this audience, but the collective investment industry, the sense of smugness. I think we need to drop that at the door and just realize like, okay, and I'm using a example of like, you know, Jerry and Vera are nervous. So the very first thing I want to do is greet with empathy. So I can say without lying, like if you're not scared, don't say you're scared. You don't have to, you don't have to enter it to be empathetic, but you can say something like, "Oh, Jerry, I can hear that must have you really worried." Right? Like, and the honest thing I always said, and it's still true, is I get really worried when I watch the news right now too. Like I got you. You know what I mean? Like, so that's like some version of greet with empathy, right? Like, tell me more, you know,
I like that framing. Like this must have you really worried. I get really worried when I watch the news now as well. There's something I just
because that's true.
yeah, like it's true and it's neutral and it's not like binding me to any particular action, but I can sort of acknowledge that
Yeah.
this is scary. I didn't even say the word scary. Worrisome
Yeah.
is more
Or
guarded. It's like
concerned. I
I
get
like
concerned when I
that.
watch the news too. You know,
Yeah.
like so that's step one. And then step two, I've always loved, and you can do this in person, you can do this on the phone, you definitely can do it on email. Step two, I just call please hold. And it's metaphorical as if you were on the phone. It's like you're just trying to create a little space between the stimulus and your response. So if it's on the phone, you can say, "Hey, before we get to that, so you've greeted with a little empathy, and then you say, Jerry, hey, thanks, I got you. Hey, before we get that, do you mind if I grab your file real quick? I just want to pull up some of our notes, remind myself." Right, just a second, please hold. Like that's where please hold came from. And if you were in person and you get a little kind of a little bit um, ambushed is not the right word, but just like a little bit surprised, you're in the conference room and this comes up and you then it's pretty easy to go, "Hey Jerry, I hear you. I think I forgot some notes. Can I go grab some?" Or, "Hey, you know what? I'd love a glass of water. Would you, Jerry and Beer, would you like some water too?" Like just get something. And again, this may be silly, but I just love the idea of just like they just did the hard thing. They're in fight or flight. Let's just create a little space.
Okay.
So, not a big deal, but I've always loved that. It feels generous to me. And so then we're like, okay, let's go. I think of it as like maybe a pyramid. I have a sketch like this. The top of the sketch, it's a pyramid, and that kind of like Maslow's hierarchy. The bottom says plan, and I've got a new one, an updated one that the bottom says purpose. But let's just stick with the plan and then the process, and then the top is the product. Remember, they're coming in at the product level. You know what I mean? That could be product economy markets.
Okay.
All these concerns come in at the product, like economy, markets,
The thing I
invest.
own that might go down
Yeah.
has a
And
little bit
and
so far
up
already.
there, up there in the, I think sometimes like that's out in the limbs of the tree. Like it's really wavy out there, like a little bit of wind, and those limbs are moving all over the place. Scary place to be for
Yep.
any of us. So the question becomes, how do we take them from there down to the base of the pyramid first, back to the plan?
Okay.
So that's where I think we're like, "Hey, let me grab my notes, come back in." And then we just go like we start at the plan. "Hey, let's just review a couple of things. Believe me, we're going to get to your concern." Like, and I always address that because I don't want them to think I've like forgotten. Like, "Hey, believe me, we're going to get to your concern. But um, remind me when you first came in, you told me this." And I always did some like repeat of the values conversation, Bill Bacharach's values conversation, or I call it a statement of financial purpose now. So I may say, like, when you first started working with me, Jerry and Vera, you told me that, and in fact, you told me 2 months ago in our quarterly review that you never want to be a burden to the kids and that you'd love to contribute to the community if there was some time and money to do so. Is that still like the base of what we're doing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Then you just sort of slowly move up. What comes after values? Like, well, here's what this looked like, and I'm gonna,
Walk
we
walk me through. Like, okay, so I mean, I'm setting this up. You you told me that you never want to be a burden on the kids and you want to contribute to the community. Like, yeah, and that's evaporating because the market's crashing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're still looking a little panicked. Okay, okay, great, totally. I just want to make sure because what we're about, and then we can say that what that looks like is you wanted to have a check. This was actually Jerry and Beer. You wanted to have a check arrive in the mailbox for $6,000 a month, and then you wanted $10,000 a year for each of the grandkids to just do. Is that still? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, and then we just slowly work our way through up to the portfolio. Remember, we invested this way because that gave us the greatest chance of meeting these goals. Like, are we still good there? And then we end with, and I'm short circuiting this real quickly so we can spend a bunch of time talking about it. We end with the idea of like, look, remember when we built this portfolio, the design of this portfolio was very, very intentional. It was built based on those values and goals we just talked about. And the design of the portfolio was to give you the greatest likelihood of meeting those goal values and goals over the long haul with the least amount of risk. And then I think this is really important. Remember when we built this portfolio, it included, and I always use this phrase, it included the weighty evidence of history. Like the software, the calculator that we use to build these portfolios includes the fact that markets go up and down because they have historically. So it includes this idea. This isn't a surprise that a market's going up or down. Now, the fact why and how much and when, yes, surprise. But the fact that it actually happened isn't a surprise. It was built into the plan. And then I just sort of this is the part where it gets really hard, and I'm super curious about your feedback on this and how you've handled it because this is the part where we just have to admit this is all based on the weighty evidence of history. New challenges arise. And scary markets are always new. Like we always say, there's nothing ever new. The precipitating event is it always feels new, right?
It
Like,
always, yeah, I mean, that to me, I know, like having now seen a decent number of these through my career, right? We do the same cycle of this time, you know, it's never different, and every time it feels different. Like we hadn't seen a pandemic in 100 years
yeah, yeah, that's a great
when
example.
COVID rolled through. I mean, we hadn't seen a financial crisis in 100 years since, ironically, the crashes in the 1900s and 19 teens that basically made the Fed to prevent the exact same kind of financial crisis that we were going through. We'd never seen a bubble in tech stocks since the tulip mania by the time we got there. Right?
Mhm.
I will admit it is part of the thing that's always been tough for me. At least I know I feel like I was trained early on that you're supposed to basically make the point that, this time isn't different. It's never different. We always think it's different,
Yeah,
but it's not really different.
me
And
too. Yeah,
now I'm like, no, it is different.
yeah,
Now let me pull out a chart and show you how historically 25 different scary things that no one had ever seen before that were always different actually turn out to have remarkably similar drawdowns of about
yeah,
how much a bear market goes down until it's
yeah,
finished and then how long it takes to recover and that you can manage that path. And you've got like
yeah,
JP
yeah.
Morgan Guide to the Markets, Clearnomics. Like there's a lot of folks out there now that make versions of the charts that
Right,
help
that chart.
to illustrate these. But
Yeah,
uh I don't know, I got tired of saying this time isn't different because
me
I'm
too,
like,
dude.
well, it
This is
really does
true.
kind of feel different. Like
Yeah, it's
I've
actually
been doing
not.
this a long time and like I've never seen a tariff war, a trade war break out.
Yeah,
Like I can read some history books and get some sense of how it goes, which usually isn't great, at least in the short term. So yeah, this feels different.
yeah, I agree. I think this is the part I really want to spend most of our time on is so far we haven't said anything about like, hey, silly you, like don't you know this time is always different. Like we're not so far we're trying to build the foundation upon which we can have a discussion now about the idea of like we built this portfolio based on the best science we have in terms of portfolio construction. And you better be darn sure of that. Like you better feel pretty calm. I think this is one of those times where you need to be able to look people in the eyes and go, this is the best way I know to do this.
Hmm.
And and then I always love Churchill's quote of democracy is the worst form of government ever created by the mind of man, except for all the others. And I think it apply that's I use that every single time. I'd say, look, this is the best way to invest money ever created. Right? Sorry, this is the worst way to invest money ever created, except for all the others. And the reason it's the worst is it doesn't protect you from these periodic times where scary unknown things sort of happen. So and then I think we're almost to the point where we're like we can now go to Michael Kitces land, right? We can now go to logic and reason because we're sort of reasoning together like, okay, now let's just look at how this is different. I'll give you that. So was the pandemic, so was 9/11, so was,
Financial crisis, 9/11, tech crash. Yeah,
they
we
all
get past
start.
all this stuff.
I started years ago. I started saying, look, they all start for different reasons. They all seem to end the same.
Oh, I
You
like
know,
that.
yeah, they all start for different reasons and they all seem to end the same. And let me walk you through how they've ended. And I think even some acknowledgement here of like, and it's reasonable for us to assume this one will end that way too. Let me show you the data, the charts, that this is where I think we've now done the hug. We're slowly working our way into logic and reason. I mean, that's not even really fair. We've done the hug. We're slowly working our way into facts and data. And because I think the hug was part of logic and reason, we're slowly working our way into facts and data. And we're now walking through to the degree, because I find that some people don't, at the end of that discussion of like, look, do you remember how we built this portfolio? And you're basically saying, like, I know what I'm doing, right? I know what I'm doing. And I'm looking in your eyes and telling you, I know no better way to do this. And if you looked for 22 years under every rock, you wouldn't find a better way to do this either. Like that's the feeling I want in on my bones. And at some for some clients, they're like, oh man, thanks. Thank you. Like, forget I called. But then there's the others that are like, yeah, yeah, cute story. Like, get me out. And I think that's the point at which we're like, okay, let's walk through how these normally end. Let me show you all the data. Let me try to like now I'm going to spray you with facts and figures because hopefully we're at a spot where we can have a rational discussion. And that rational discussion even acknowledges some idea of like, look, so far they all have ended the same. And I think the only reasonable bet is that this one will end the same as well. But that we got to remember that we're not actually sure of that.
Yeah.
But it is if you're a rational, reasonable human looking at probabilities in any way that makes sense, it's reasonable for you to conclude that that's how a rational human would behave. And then one last bit, and then let's just break it down a little bit. Is I always loved when if somebody was really pushing, like yeah, and I can think of their names. I know exactly when it was. One of them was SARS. I only had two in my whole career where like they blew out. Only two. One was SARS, and one was housing, the 2009. Um, and I can remember having but I had lots of these kind of conversations. And the where you end up here is like, okay, let's take the other. What's our alternative? Like we got all this data and experience and history that says this is the right way to do it. What's our alternative? Our alternative is I mean, I always remember saying like the markets are going to see like in 2009 was a good example of this, like maybe the markets are going to cease to exist in the way that they've existed in the past. Okay, if that's true, what would be the appropriate portfolio for that? Right? You exaggerate with guns and butter, right? Something to protect yourself with and something to trade. And then I always like to say, what percentage of the time of your investing life or our investing history have guns and butter been the right portfolio? Right? So which one should we pick? The one that's never been the right portfolio? Or the one that has always been, knowing that we're still taking risk? And I think that's why it's called the risk premium. I think we underestimate the risk. I think we underestimate the reality that like, hey, this is called risk.
Mhm.
And then the last thing I want to say, and then I promise I'll stop and we can break it down a bit, is remember there's nothing that says you have to be invested in the equity markets. I mean, now is not the time to jump into the water. But let's remember if we decide we don't like this, let's write ourselves a little note. I used to have people record video. Actually, no, I didn't because it was before. If I was doing it now, I'd probably have people record a little video to themselves. I would save that video. I had a couple clients write letters to themselves about how they felt, and I saved those letters until we were, like recovered. Because guess what happens when you're recovered and you go to get more conservative? Well, they don't want to do that. What risk? What are you talking about? Pull out the letter, read the letter. But I think it's important to remember, like, you don't have, just because you're a financial planner doesn't mean you have to convince people that they have to invest in equity markets, right? You can build a plan that doesn't involve that. Okay, so that's what do you want to talk about?
I I'm kind of focused on just your sequencing around this. It is where my head goes. Just look like I've the well, I mean, my brain goes immediately to the logic stuff. So like, oh, a client wants to sell. I'm so ready to have this debate. Let's go.
Yeah.
Uh
Yeah.
and right, and per the discussion of like why are they calling when they kind of know what we're probably gonna say, like, well, I guess I'll even double-edged sword. Like sometimes they're not calling for a debate. They're calling because they're freaking out and they know what you're gonna say, but they're freaking out anyways. And sometimes they're literally calling for the debate, which
Right.
is like I'm freaking out and I know you're going to try to talk me out of it and I'm calling you because I need you to talk me out of it. And like
Yeah.
that's why I'm calling you and I know what you're going to say, but I need to hear you say it and I need your calming voice and the way that you always bring me back to center and like
Right.
talk me off the proverbial ledge. That I feel like even there's a difference between those in how we handle them, and it's a difference I didn't appreciate in the past. So I would treat everything like they're calling for a debate,
Mhm.
and because I like to debate, and
Mhm.
instead
Mhm.
of at least trying to pause and say like, okay, like I'm going to kind of overgeneralize. Like um there's three versions of how this goes from clients. Like Carl, this tariff stuff is just freaking me out. We need to sell, right? Which is essentially like, get me out now. There's Carl, I'm freaking out about this tariff stuff and I'm thinking about selling, which I find is that's usually the I want you to talk me out of it. That's why I started thinking about it. Like I've seen versions of that. And then there's one that's maybe like one step further down in sort of the severity scale. That is, so Carl, what are we doing about this tariffs stuff? And obviously, client is reaching out because they're feeling some concern and anxiety about these. But I feel like they deserve to be like I think they deserve different kind of process and prioritization because the client's like, Carl, I'm freaking out about the tariffs. We need to sell. I'm in full blown panic mode, which to me gets right back to like I really appreciate your wording of right, like Jerry, this sounds like you're really worried. Yeah, I get really worried when I watch the news right now as well. Hey, let me pull up your portfolio. Can I just put you on hold for a moment? I just want to pull up all the information so I've got it handy, and I can put you in the pause timeout box. What
Please hold.
as you had framed it,
Yeah.
and then I can come back and do the we're gonna get to your concern. Let's go back over goals. Let's go back over what we were trying to accomplish. And now at least by the time we get there, hopefully you're like one step down on the panic scale.
Yeah, let me just mention something right there because I think it's really important is that the time of that,
Mm-hmm.
like that obviously could vary. Like you might have a hardcore stereotypical, Kitces engineer where you're just like, "Hey, I just got to double check a few things." Okay, great. Let's talk about the facts, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting everybody needs
Well,
20 minutes of
that's
therapy.
That's why I think about tiering them. I that right the next like Carl like this tariff stuff starting to freak me out. I'm thinking we might need to sell. Right, something to that effect. Which is like, okay, so you're thinking about it. You haven't like asked me to make a decision. You haven't asked me to take a trade for you, or I'm supposed to like immediately talk you off. You're clearly upset and anxious, but you may not be in the same like I don't know what
Yeah.
it's like amygdala hijack. My brain isn't even responding to logic right now, but I find like those are the I'm calling because I need you to talk me out of this.
And are
And
you suggesting that that might need less time in the sort of
I,
empathy zone?
I think so, although ironically, even as I say that, like it still feels right to at least start there, right? Like it sounds like you're really worried.
Yeah, or it could even be maybe a little less. It could be more like, oh, got it. I'm hearing a lot about that in the news as well. Tell me what's got you worried, right? Like to so because often I remember Michael Bungay Stainer, who is a great coach about coaching. Like he's a great writes a lot about coaching. He says your I mean this is his language. He's like your advice always almost always sucks because you're giving advice about the wrong thing. Right. So sometimes we're immediately like, oh, yeah, you're calling about tariffs. Okay, let me, and they might be, yeah, yeah, tariffs. But I'm also worried because my daughter just, you know,
Just going to
whatever.
college at McGill and like in
Or,
6 months
yeah,
he's
or
gonna get
my,
over the
or, hey,
border.
you know what? On top of it, I've been reading all this AI stuff. So I think just so, it at least deserves, and that can be part of the empathy piece of this
Yeah.
conversation is, yeah, yeah, I'm not, yeah, yeah, but hey, Michael, I'm worried a bit. I mean, yeah, there's a lot going on in the news, isn't there? Tell me what specifically you're worried about. Right? Like just getting some sense of like, help me understand, let me hear you. I don't think anybody, even the most, sort of engineer brain person in the world, isn't going to appreciate that question.
Yes. Yes. Then they'll start riffing on what's going on. At least I get more zeroed in on this. I mean that's part of where it's going. If I think about the third version in particular, right? The client that just kind of reached out like, so Carl, what are we doing about this tariff stuff? Right? Which I thought like right for some clients that's like the oblique way to kind of say like I'm sort of worried and I know I'm supposed to not be freaking out so I'm not calling to say I'm freaking out but I'm still sort of anxious so like so what are we doing about this tariffs thing because you're supposed to be
Yeah.
doing something apparently right there's a lot that's actually loaded into that version of the
Yeah.
question for which I find like that takes me very quickly then to you know yeah, there's been a lot of stuff in the news about that lately. Which part has you worried? Like, what are you focused on right now?
Yeah. And I even
Trying to
love,
turn it
like,
back to them.
I even
Not because I'm
love,
dodging it, just like, what are
yeah.
you really actually anxious about so I don't spend a couple minutes talking about the wrong version?
Yeah. And this is one interesting point I think is important. How often have we seen like proactively we reach out to clients and say, "Hey, I'm calling because it's been really crazy news. We want to talk." And they're like, "What? It has? Should I be worried?" So even there where you were like, "Hey, what are we doing about this tariff stuff?" You corrected yourself, which I loved, which was, "Hey, what are we doing about this tariff stuff?" You know, what are you worried about you? And then you corrected yourself and said, like, what are you thinking about? Or what are you know what I mean? So it's like, if they're not using language around worry or scared or feared, let's not use language around that. But
Ah,
we can still ask a similar question, like, oh, tell me what's got you, what are you thinking? That's, I think, what you said. Like what and
yeah,
what yeah, what's got you thinking? I love that. And then the one thing I want to mention about all three of these versions is I noticed this and I did this for years and I don't know that I ever stopped doing it, but I don't think it's a good idea. Is because all bear markets to date have ended the same, all scary markets, because this isn't even a bear market, right? At least as of what we're talking
right.
about, it's not even close, right? All scary markets end the same. Sometimes there's a tendency to feel like we don't even need to have an opinion, an educated opinion about the current news, right? Because we're trying to get everybody to ignore the news, don't like the news. But I do think it's, and I might be wrong about this, but I do think it's, I don't know that it's expected or what the right word is even, but
Mm.
I think it's pretty reassuring to clients to know that you've thought about it
Yep.
and that you have an educated, defensible opinion about it that demonstrates that you can still arrive at the same spot. Like, hey, you know what? We've given a lot of thought of this. Like, we take this stuff seriously. Here's what we're thinking, and it still ends up at the same place, but I think sometimes we are too quick to dismiss. I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but it feels like sometimes we're too quick to dismiss the need to be educated about what's going on in the news because the news is always just creating bad behavior.
Yeah.
And there's some element of this that like clients live in the news. Like
Yeah.
clients live in the world. We're probably going to need to be able to at least be conversant in some of those things that are scary to them. I think I might have that wrong. Or you could have a whole client base because I know there are people listening to this because I had a client base close to this and I know exactly who I could call right now. A guy named Matt, I could call right now and he would be like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about because none of my clients are worried.
Yeah.
He's just done such a crazy job of either self-selecting
Hmm.
or training it out of them, detoxing clients. Largely, I think it's a self-selecting plus a little bit of detox
Yeah.
that it's just not even an issue, even when it's get really scary. Great. But for most of us, we deal with humans.
Yeah. Which for me, like once we're in logic place, it just tends to come back to well, it's sci-fi because once you get to the logic place, there's sort of two threads of conversation to me. There is let's just kind of do the logic-y conversation, right? Tech crash, 9/11, financial crisis, global pandemics. Now it's tariffs. Okay, so what are some of the ways that this plays out? What are the bad versions? What are the good versions? There are actually good versions where this ends out reallocating what countries work on what, and we end up with a big domestic manufacturing boom because people don't want to send things back and forth across borders so much anymore. So we actually just bring stuff more back to the US and make more stuff here in the US, which actually lifts income and economic growth so much that we can actually afford the fact that things are slightly more expensive. And our deficits go down because tariffs are literally revenue. Most people forget, like, we spent the first 150 years heavily financing the federal government by tariffs. The income tax came later. That's just the past 100 years of 250 plus years of history. So,
Mm,
there's kind of the logic points of tariffs. And then, I mean, there's just the let's just kind of talk this through from the financial planning perspective, right? I like how you said, like, they all start for different reasons. They all end about the same. Like, look, the average bear market's 35% top to bottom. So let's just take a look. Like, here's how much down you're already. Here's how much more it'll go if this really plays out. Like, let's just get clear.
right, right,
How long does it typically take to recover? Okay, year or two, depending on whose data you use and where, which dimensions that they measure from. So then that usually gets some version of the client saying like, well, can we just sell now and get back in later, right? So
right.
then we can have the whole how difficult is it to time? Look, I can sell here, but I'm just wondering, like, if we do that sale for you, what's your trigger going to be to get back in? Like, how will
Right,
you
right.
know when it's okay again?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's the Buddhist second arrow problem. Like the first arrow is don't make it worse.
yeah,
Because now you got a second arrow, which is now you're gonna be sitting there wondering when you should get back in. So yeah, there's all sorts of conversations around that for sure. But yeah, you're right. We're also at the 10 miss the 10 best days. Like we're at the and hopefully at that point we can have some logical
yeah.
discussion around those things.
And my goal, at least usually in those conversations, is if we can at least acknowledge this is difficult to time, right? How did you handle COVID or financial crisis? And I love like, you held all the way through. Awesome. How did that go? You sold. Okay. How did that go? Oh yeah. The market rebounded 47% before I got back in. Cool. So like, do you want to do that risk again?
Right.
Or
Yep.
How are you feeling about riding this out? I mean, conversely, every now and then the client's like, "Yeah, I sold out right, but I sold out. I actually got out before it was horrible, and then I got in much lower because I figured it had to be pretty bad." I'm like, "Well, good to know because if you actually successfully timed the last one, then this is going to be a very hard conversation to not convince you to try to get like, I may as well get clear, right? Like
Right.
how
Start your
did
own hedge
you
fund.
what did you do in COVID? What did you do in the financial crisis?" But my goal, at least, was always like, look, here's how far it typically goes, and it's a lot further than where it is now. So let's at least see if we're ready to prepare for what may come next. How long does it take to recover? How impossibly difficult is this to time? And if it's that hard to time and it's going to go down that far and it's going to take that much time to come back, are we going to be okay if we just ride this out?
Yeah.
And that at some point gets dictated by your plan. Like I can I run updated projections and we'll see. Like if all the bad things I just like it goes down more than 35% top to bottom and it takes 2 or 3 years to fully recover, just to even get back to where we are today. Can I just run the numbers? Let's see if that actually materially impacts your plan and all the goals that you said you wanted to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's a really good like end of scenario sort of I like third level layer. Like I'm still worried, I'm still worried, I'm still worried. I think going to that spot where you're like, look, we don't know. I mean, the reason this is so difficult is this could turn around tomorrow. And I've seen it over and over and over, just about the time I can promise you right now, if we sell, the market's going to turn around. If we don't sell, the market's going to keep going down. I promise. Right. Like I just don't know how to change that. And I think you kind of acknowledge the idea of like, we don't know where we are in this situation. Like this could all blow over. I've seen this a million times, not a million. I've seen this 100 times. This could all blow over. It could be no big deal. It could be apocalypse. What does Nick Murray call it? Apocalypse du jour. It could be any of those things. But I do love the idea of like, hey, you know what? What if let's just scenario test this?
Yeah.
Because I remember doing that a couple of times. I'm like, clients, how bad is it? Like,
Like
could
it's
you could you avoid a cost of living increase for a year or two?
yeah,
Like, could we just not give you your raise? Is that it? Like, no, yeah.
yeah.
Could you just not take your raise? Right? Like that kind of idea. So I like that idea of like ending, not ending this conversation necessarily. I'm just saying like getting to that spot where you're like, let me just stress test this for you,
Yeah.
right? Let's pretend like this is what happens. Because I think clients think it's a lot worse than it normally is. In fact, I know they do. I
I
know I
just
do. As a human, I do.
just warms my heart, Carl, that we're going to end with like a spreadsheet and a financial
Oh, the
projection
biggest spreadsheet you've
and a
ever
Monte
seen.
Carlo analysis.
Yes,
I'm
up
feeling so
100%.
much.
100%.
Feeling better now. I'm feeling better now.
100%. I believe me, despite all my little games around this stuff, I know how to do that stuff. Oh, at least I used to know how to do that stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Carl.
Yeah, cheers.